This is the story of the Nigerian jihadist Abu Bakr al-Shekawi, or just Shekau, who became such a universally despised terrorist and menace to society that even the terror organization Islamic State conducted an anti-terrorist operation against him and also described him as, quote, someone who committed unimaginable terrorism. Which really says a lot when you take into account what kinds of lunatics Islamic State are, and on top of that, Shekau's actions became so notorious that he even inspired a plot point in Marvel's Black Panther. But who was this man, and how could one possibly become this universally despised? Well, our story begins in northeastern Nigeria in the small town of Shekau, where Abu Bakr Shekau was born into a poor, semi-nomadic Muslim family in around 1970. Shekau's mother stated in an interview with Voice of America that she and her son Shekau were so poor that they even sometimes would have to beg for food just to get by. That, however, didn't stop Shekau from learning both Hausa, Fulani, some Arabic, and English at school, and at some point during his childhood, Shekau also became very devout in his Islamic faith. Because of his deep faith in Islam, in 1990, Shekau moved to the capital of Borno State, where he enrolled in the Borno College of Legal and Islamic Studies, despite still living in abject poverty. His classmates at the time described him as being very radical in his Islamic beliefs, but he wasn't taken seriously, since it seemed like he had a couple of screws loose, something I think anyone will agree with after we get to see his videos.
Arnane! Arnane! Arnane!
Because of his Islamist beliefs, Shekau left the Islamic college without ever earning a degree, but he wasn't going to need one anyways where he was going. After having left university, Shekau doubled down on his radical beliefs by beginning to follow the cleric Muhammad Yusuf. Muhammad Yusuf was actually born as a Shia Muslim, but he became such a radical Salafi that he would practically denounce every single person who didn't follow his beliefs to the letter as heretics who could be killed. A belief that would heavily influence Shekau's own worldview and his increasing militancy. When Shekau began following Muhammad Yusuf, Yusuf had already founded what can best be described as a sect, and the group was named Jama'at al-Sunnah lid-Dawa wal-Jihad. But it was nicknamed Boko Haram, meaning Western education is forbidden in the Hausa language, since Western education teaches such horrific things like that the earth is round, among other things. Yes, one of Boko Haram's beliefs was that the earth is flat, so this group might be the closest things we will ever get to militant flat earthers. Boko Haram's dislike for Western education and civilization was, however, just one part of their ideology. Yusuf and Shekau's real goal was to create an Islamic empire that would rule over all of Western Africa. But for now, Shekau and Yusuf laid low since they knew that they wouldn't be able to wage jihad without first building a base of support and growing stronger. So for several years, they provided religious education for young people and did charity while recruiting more and more followers to their cause. This was allowed to continue uninterrupted by the incredibly corrupt Nigerian government, despite Boko Haram growing increasingly well-armed and militant. Not to mention, for a short amount of time, Boko Haram even became affiliated with Al-Qaeda. This relationship, however, quickly ended when Al-Qaeda realized that Yusuf was too much of an unreliable nutjob for them, something we will later see mirrored with Shekau and another group. In 2009, tensions between Boko Haram and the Nigerian security forces finally boiled over into clashes between the two when Boko Haram attacked Nigerian military bases, which unsurprisingly resulted in Nigerian forces surrounding Muhammad Yusuf's home, where he lived with his 4 wives and 12 children. Muhammad Yusuf was then taken to a police station where Yusuf was summarily executed by the police. The police claimed that he was trying to escape, but everyone knew that that wasn't the truth. This tough blow to Boko Haram, a group that was founded upon Muhammad Yusuf's particular inventions upon Salafi Islamism, however, marked the rise of Abu Bakr Shekau, who would prove himself to be an even more outlandish leader than his predecessor. So now Shekau, the devout but slightly strange young man who came from a poor village, was the leader of a powerful political group. What kind of leader would Shekau be? A strong but kind leader who would fight for his faith, or a cruel tyrant? I mean, look at this sane-looking human being. This is Shekau in the flesh and blood. Doesn't he look like a normal, neurotypical individual? Well, let's just say that calling Shekau a cruel tyrant would be the understatement of the century. Under Shekau's leadership, Boko Haram ramped up the group's campaign of terror by using suicide bombers against churches during Mass just because they were Christians. But they also targeted mosques, whose imams were viewed as being too moderate. You can't really tell just how crazy Shekau was from Boko Haram's first videos. Here he looks more like your generic militant cleric, but I feel like Shekau's next video really does him justice and serves as a great introduction to, Shekau.
‘Yan izala arna ne, tarikatu tujaniya arna ne, kadiriya arna ne, kashabandiya arna ne, shazaliya arna ne, mutazila arna ne, ‘yan shi'a arna ne, demokrasi arna ne, saudiyatul arabiya ma ba islamiya ba ne, ‘yan alu sa'ud ne, ba masu bin annabi ba ne, Ka'aba gidan Allah ne, masallacin annabi gida ne. Idan Allah ya kai mu za mu je mu yi aikin hajji, tun da kun canja addinin Allah sai kun shiga wuta 'yan Saudiya. Abinda muke bi Kur'ani ne. Mu 'yan Kur'ani ne, mu 'yan sunna ne. Ba yabon ku muke so ba. Ai ba sai kun ce mana mu mutanen kirki bane za mu zama mutanen kirki. Ai me neman yabon mutane ma makaryaci ne. Arna ne, arna ne, arna ne. Za mu kashe, za mu rike bayi, za mu sayar. Za mu sayar. Shekau, shekakau, shekau, kau, kakau, kau, kakakakakakakau. Wannan shine Shekau in baka gane ba. Shekau. Wannan shine.
What a nice young man. The Shekau, Kau, Shekau, Kau part has been burnt into my mind since back in 2015, and I can't be the only one.
Secular education, support and music. As a result of this today, many Muslims lost their Islam.
An example of one of Shekau's crimes was the Gujba College attack, where Boko Haram terrorists killed 44 people. The motive was revenge for the fact that the Nigerian government was interfering in Islamic education too much for Shekau's taste. Thus, according to Shekau's reptile brain, the logical response to this was of course to go onto a random college campus and do this against young people who just wanted an education and who, by the way, were predominantly from Muslim backgrounds. Shekau would go on to commit far more of these attacks, and in fact it got so bad that in 2012 even Al-Qaeda further distanced themselves from Boko Haram and Shekau after he decided to ignore a strongly worded letter from Al-Qaeda that told Shekau to get a hold of himself and stop being so bloodthirsty. Shekau's bad relations with the world's primary international jihadist group and his generally erratic leadership eventually resulted in many members leaving Boko Haram and instead forming their own new splinter groups. These new groups would of course use their resources on fighting the real enemy, their fellow jihadists who were still in Boko Haram, Judean People's Front movement. These splinter groups would however later be defeated by Shekau's loyalists. This internal civil war, however, didn't teach Shekau any lessons, which is evident by the fact that Shekau just straight up executed his own religious advisors after his outlandish religious beliefs were refuted by them. But what religious beliefs can be so extreme that even a hardcore jihadist scholar goes, dude, chill? Well, let's let Shekau himself explain who exactly he considers a true believer. Shekau believes that any Muslim that willingly lives outside of areas controlled by jihadists is no longer a true believer and therefore worthy of death. Which is why Shekau also kept targeting people of his own faith. And while this belief is not completely uncommon among jihadists, Shekau goes an extra step further by saying that not only are these people non-believers, but also any Muslim who disagrees with who he considers a non-believer is also a non-believer by extension, and the people who disagree with them being non-believers are also non-believers, and so on and so on. This chain of becoming a non-believer could in theory continue forever until everyone except for the wannabe cult leader Shekau and his most devoted followers were the only people worthy left of being alive on the planet. Which is probably why he killed his religious advisors, since they, as Islamic scholars, most likely believed that this was completely kooky and were thus, according to Shekau, non-believers. But these beliefs didn't stop Shekau from continuing to attract new followers and targeting more and more Nigerian educational institutions for providing what the group considered Western education. However, the event that would make the whole world give Shekau and Boko Haram the attention that they were craving happened on the 14th of April, 2014. When the group kidnapped 276 mostly Christian female students between the ages of 16 and 18 from an all-girls school in the town of Chibok, located in northeastern Nigeria. The kidnappers entered the school pretending to be soldiers of the Nigerian army and were originally only intending to steal machinery from the school to fund their insurgency. But when they essentially stumbled across the girls, they changed their priorities and loaded all 276 girls onto trucks and then drove them into the Sambisa forest, which was a Boko Haram stronghold that will feature heavily in this story. Shortly thereafter, Shekau released footage of the schoolgirls where they were all wearing Islamic clothing, reciting the Quran, and holding Shekau's flag. I can't imagine just how scared these poor innocent girls were after having been taken so far away from their homes by Shekau and his underlings. The scale of this mass kidnapping made it prime content for the international press, which was then followed by international condemnation from every single nation known to man. Shekau, unsurprisingly to anyone who was slightly familiar with the man, however, found this newfound infamy hilarious and started posting 240p videos containing deranged rants and plenty of random gunfire.
Na ce boko ma ta shi yayi ba ku ji ba ne a tashi a boko yan mata ku je ku yi aure zan maimaita wannan magana har yanzu tegu ni na kama yan mata naku zan sayar a kasuwa wallahi akwai kasuwa na sayar da mutum Allah ne ya ce in sayar me shine yayi umurce ni in sayar zan sayar da mata ina sayar da mata. Either you are with us, I mean real Muslims whom are following Salaf footsteps, or you are with the Obama, Professor Holland, George Bush, Clinton. I forgot not Abraham Lincoln.
Shekau's kidnapping of the girls even became cemented in pop culture forever thanks to Marvel's Black Panther, where they rescue the girls from the Sambisa jungle. If only that could have happened in our timeline. Regarding the kidnapped students, some converted to Islam and married their kidnappers to get better conditions, while others ended up being forced to cook and do manual labor for Shekau's fighters. Thankfully, some of the students have been rescued by the Nigerian military, but many more are still missing till this day. However, by late 2014, a new faction was appearing within the African Islamist landscape, and that faction was of course Islamic State, also known as ISIS. After having conquered large cities in both Iraq and Syria, Islamic State had now begun to essentially franchise by allowing already established jihadist groups like Boko Haram to swear allegiance to Islamic State, thus quickly turning the group into a global threat. But Shekau, however, wasn't willing to give up his role as supreme leader to anyone. I mean, he probably thought things were going pretty well, considering he was still controlling large parts of northern Nigeria and killing innocent people left and right. but his soldiers and commanders had been inspired by Islamic State's global message. Therefore, his commanders began pressuring Shekau to swear allegiance to Islamic State, and Shekau realized that if he didn't pledge allegiance, Shekau's commanders would just replace him with someone who would. So Shekau very reluctantly pledged allegiance to Islamic State's leader, Baghdadi, and in return stayed leader of Boko Haram, who would be renamed Islamic State West Africa Province.
من أخيكم في الله أبي محمد أبي بكر بن محمد الشكوي إمام جماعة أهل السنة للدعوة والجهاد نعلن مبايعة الخليفة إبراهيم بن عواد بن إبراهيم الحسيني القريشي.
Now, Shekau's fighters probably felt on top of the world. Not only were they in control of large swaths of territory, but now they would also likely receive far more aid from a much larger organization. However, in reality, the Boko Haram Islamic State merger would turn out to be the beginning of the end for Shekau. Now, considering that Shekau was a megalomaniacal maniac who believed that the earth is flat and that everyone was a non-believer, Shekau didn't really like accepting the role as number two. These leadership disagreements quickly created two different factions within the group, a pro-Shekau loyalist faction and a pro-Islamic State faction that actually seemed somewhat reasonable in comparison to Shekau. The first point of contention between Shekau's loyalists and the Islamic State faction was the lighthearted topic of suicide bombers. After having become part of the Islamic State, Shekau had received strict orders from Islamic State leadership to stop using women and children, but Shekau just straight up refused, thus causing tensions between the two factions. The second demand from Islamic State leadership was to stop attacking Muslim villages and kidnapping non-combatants, which Shekau naturally also refused to do. But wait, why would Shekau kill other Muslims? Well, as you might have guessed by now, despite having officially joined Islamic State, Shekau hadn't actually changed any of his own beliefs in the slightest, which again were that literally anyone who doesn't actively seek to live under Sharia law can just be straight up killed. So in total, Shekau and his fighters simply proved to be far too extreme and murderous even for a group like Islamic State. This internal disunity within the group likely also harmed its effectiveness on the battlefield, because during 2015, Shekau and Islamic State thankfully suffered setback after setback, and in late 2015, the group was driven into the Sambisa forest, which is a huge Nigerian forest not far from the Cameroonian border. Being left to govern a giant chimpanzee reserve obviously wasn't what neither Shekau nor Islamic State had wanted out of the merger, and Islamic State leadership began to look for someone to blame. During 2016, tensions between Shekau's faction and the Islamic State faction turned into violent clashes, but Shekau tried to play it off as nothing more than minor disagreements with his rivals. But the Islamic State leadership obviously knew that this was a lie and saw what was really happening. And that was that Shekau was unreliable, too insane for even them, and had outlived his uses, since Islamic State now had its own faction of loyalists in Western Africa. So in August 2016, Shekau was replaced by Abu Musab al-Barnawi, who wasn't only a hardcore Islamic State loyalist, but also the son of Muhammad Yusuf, Shekau's mentor and the original founder of Boko Haram. After having become Islamic State's new leader in Western Africa, Barnawi said that he, unlike Shekau, would not target mosques and markets, which seemed to win him a lot of support among the average fighters. Wait a minute, just stop for a second. Can you imagine actually being a Nigerian jihadist and fighting other Nigerian jihadists over the right to kill fellow believers and who you can use as suicide bombers? This is how insane the situation I'm talking about here is. This is crazy. It's crazy. But what did Shekau think about this sudden demotion? Did he and his supporters declare that the Islamic State are a bunch of softies and leave the group, or did he accept the demotion? He did neither. Like usual, he ignored the order and claimed that he was still the leader of Islamic State in West Africa. But surprisingly, both factions ended up agreeing to disagree and just kind of started operating as two independent groups, with Shekau's group still being somewhat larger, but with Barnawi's group becoming more technologically superior, likely thanks to advisors that had traveled from, Islamic State's areas in Iraq and Syria. Between 2016 and 2021, things remained tense but peaceful. Shekau, however, just couldn't stop being an absolute lunatic and continued to kill and harass all the local Muslims, since basically only 0.01% of all Muslims were considered true Muslims according to Shekau. This angered the Islamic State loyalists, who were growing to the point where they were not only better organized and technologically superior to Shekau's forces, but also had more numbers. Oh yeah, the Islamic State faction also released an entire book debunking Shekau, like a whole proper book just purely hating on Shekau. It's like when YouTubers release exposed videos on each other, that when they're beefing with each other. Essentially, Islamic State did that to Shekau. So let's recap how many different groups wanted Shekau dead in 2021. The West wanted him dead for being a jihadist and for kidnapping the schoolgirls. The Nigerian government wanted him dead, quite literally for wanting to overthrow the Nigerian government. The surrounding states wanted him dead for also waging a border war in their countries. The Nigerian Christians wanted him dead because he'd been terrorizing them for years upon years just because they existed. The Nigerian Muslims wanted him dead because Shekau wanted to kill them for not being Muslim enough. And finally, Islamic State wanted him either completely disarmed or dead for being a bothersome and unpredictable person that somehow managed to make them look even worse and more extreme than they actually are. So basically, Shekau was, as of 2021, completely isolated and hated by everyone on the planet. But back to Islamic State and Shekau. So now Islamic State had finally gotten stronger than Shekau's faction in Nigeria, and therefore Islamic State's central leadership ordered Barnawi to subdue Shekau once and for all. This began on the 14th of May 2021 when Islamic State launched a, bear with me now, self-described anti-terrorist operation against the extremist Shekau and his followers, who were still hiding out in the Sambisa forest. With its better organization, Islamic State quickly advanced into the Sambisa forest, killing some of Shekau's men and accepting many other deserters into its own ranks. So already on the 18th of May, Shekau was hiding from Islamic State patrols who were using loudspeakers to urge any remaining Shekau supporters to surrender in exchange for forgiveness. So on that day, Shekau held a speech with a much more somber tone than usual. In the speech, he stated that he would never be loyal to anybody, but at the same time, he also stated that he was still loyal to Islamic State's leadership. Shekau was really one of a kind. And finally, he also stated that he regretted none of his ideological and religious positions whatsoever, but his tone of voice made it clear that he knew it was game over. After this speech, Shekau agreed to meet with the Islamic State faction to discuss a surrender agreement in which Shekau and his commanders would be allowed to live in exchange for facilitating the smooth and complete merger of the two groups under undisputed Islamic State leadership. Shekau, however, decided to do a little trolling and showed up to the negotiations secretly wearing a suicide vest filled with explosives. Why he was wearing the suicide vest, we will never know. Maybe it was as a last resort in case the Islamic State would try to ambush him, maybe it was in case the negotiations went south, or maybe he just truly could not live with not being number one and instead preferred to cause one last act of destruction against his fellow believers before going to the deepest depths of hell where he belongs. What happened was that after several hours of intense negotiation with the Islamic State commanders, Shekau out of nowhere detonated his vest, killing one Islamic State commander in the process. This move apparently took the Islamic State leadership by complete surprise. Shekau quite literally made Islamic State seem tame in every single category. This guy is the definition of I'm not locked in here with you, you are locked in here with me. He was terrorizing terrorists left and right. He was such a big terrorist that even the worst terrorist organization on the planet was getting terrorized by him. So while this marked the definitive end of Shekau, how did the world react to his death? Well, his followers reacted by completely surrendering to the Islamic State with the exception of a few die-hard loyalists who are still hiding around the border till this day. The local population reacted by celebrating and partying with some Fire Burna Boy and Wizkid bangers. The Nigerian government and the rest of the world were also pretty stoked, but at the same time worried, since this could mean that the Islamic State might grow stronger in Africa, And finally, Barnawi and Islamic State reacted to Shekau's death by releasing the following message. Now, bear with me again. Shekau was the leader of disobedience and corruption. This is someone who committed unimaginable terrorism. Again, this is coming from one of the most bloodthirsty and disgusting groups on the planet. And finally, what happens now? Well, Islamic State is still active in Western Africa, but it hasn't been able to reach the territorial control or influence that Boko Haram had in 2014. And hopefully they never will, because Abu Bakr al-Shekawi and his gang of equally deranged followers has already caused so much meaningless suffering and death in Western Africa, especially to impoverished people living in rural areas just like the one that Shekau's own family came from. Finally, a huge thank you to my patrons and my YouTube channel members for making this video possible. You guys are a huge help since this project is what the majority of my time gets spent on. If you also want to make more videos like this one possible, then consider joining them in supporting my channel on Patreon or as a YouTube channel member. If you support me on either of these platforms, you receive benefits like early access to new videos, behind the scenes content like uncut videos, raw scripts for upcoming videos, and finally you receive a shout out at the end of every video. The current patrons and YouTube channel members that are making these videos possible are Justin, Luke, Jean, and Laurentius. You guys are amazing.